In his time, James Wilkinson was a joke, but after his death, America learned the shocking truth. He was so much worse than that. In fact, he was one of the most sinister figures in American history. The story of the American Revolution is filled with figures of great historical importance. Some, like Jefferson, Washington, and Franklin, are remembered as great statesmen. Others, like the Marquis de Lafayette, are remembered for their contributions to the War for Independence. However, while all these men are studied and venerated, one Revolutionary War figure is rarely discussed. And for good reason. James Wilkinson was a military leader during the birth of the nation, but if it had been up to him, America would have never existed. Wilkinson was born in 1757 and was only 19 years old when the Declaration of Independence was written and the US began its fight for freedom. By this point in his life, Wilkinson had already seen any chance at a family inheritance evaporate with the death of his father. What little property and wealth was left over from his father's debts went to Wilkinson's older brother. The only thing that the second child was left with was a lesson he would never forget. The last words Joseph Wilkinson had told his son James were, "My son, if you ever put up with an insult, I will disinherit you." James was raised with the core belief that an image of respectability was far more important than any sort of moral consistency. In short, it didn't matter what a man did, as long as he looked proper doing it. This skewed moral compass and his need to restore his family's wealth would lead Wilkinson down a path of betrayal and subterfuge. However, when the War for Independence started, James saw it as an opportunity. He was studying medicine when the fighting started, but left his schooling to join the Maryland militia. This is when he crossed paths with another notorious American. Benedict Arnold was commanding a force that was laying siege to Quebec. The US forces had pushed into Canadian territory and were engaging British forces in the then colonial territory. Wilkinson did little to help. By the time he had arrived in Quebec, the British had sent upwards of 8,000 men to reinforce the besieged territory. This turned the tide of the Canadian invasion and pushed the US forces back across the border. This left Wilkinson in need of another posting. He had previously served as an aide to several prominent generals, such as Nathaniel Greene. After Quebec, he returned to being an aide, this time for Horatio Gates. It was during his time as an aide to Gates that he first gained some real attention from American leadership. Unfortunately, it wasn't for anything good. In 1777, Gates had sent Wilkinson to address Congress. Tasked with delivering a report on the victory at the Battle of Saratoga, it was an opportunity for Wilkinson. However, he instead chose to ignore this opportunity by keeping the entire Congress waiting for an extended period of time. He decided to first focus on several personal errands. When he finally appeared before the fledgling Congress, he delivered his report. However, he highly embellished his own involvement. Lying to the leaders of the American nation paid off this time for Wilkinson. He was temporarily promoted to Brigadier General and appointed to the newly commissioned Board of War. This promotion wasn't the boost he had hoped for, however. Many of the other commanders disliked Wilkinson for several reasons. Firstly, he was very young and inexperienced, which made him seem like the wrong choice for this assignment when other older and more seasoned officers were passed over. There was also the fact that Wilkinson had a habit of running his mouth, especially about his supposed involvement in a secret conspiracy to oust George Washington from leadership. The Conway Cabal was one of America's first failed coups. Horatio Gates had organized the attempt to replace Washington with himself as head of the Continental Army. His aide at the time, Wilkinson, was allegedly part of this plot. However, he was also the one who betrayed it, albeit unintentionally. Gates and Washington had been at odds several times during the war, with Gates sidestepping Washington's command during the Battle of Saratoga. He feared that Washington was becoming too much of an idol to the American people, and this would be a danger to the ideology of republicanism. This came to a head with the involvement of Thomas Conway. Conway was also highly critical of Washington and his command. The two had become bitter rivals and opposed each other politically during the war. Washington had openly opposed Conway's promotion to Brigadier General and had stated that he was without conspicuous merit. Washington even threatened to resign if Conway was given more power. This threat caused the Continental Congress to second-guess Conway's leadership. Conway didn't take this lying down. He wrote a letter to Horatio Gates complaining about Washington and asking Gates for help in removing the general. In the letter, he stated, "Heaven has been determined to save your country, or a weak general and and bad counselors would have ruined it. The letter would have stayed between Conway and Gates if it were not for Wilkinson. Wilkinson had seen the contents of the letter, as he was still serving as Gates' aide at the time. Sometime later, while in the presence of General William Alexander, Wilkinson got blind drunk. In his intoxicated state, he openly bragged about the letter, even letting slip the exact quotation about Washington's leadership. General Alexander was a friend and supporter of Washington, and quickly wrote a letter himself to the commander of the Continental Army. Needless to say, Washington was furious. He wrote a letter to Conway, accusing him of conspiring with Gates. Conway denied writing the quoted passage, but it was too late and the cabal fell apart. Conway was humiliated, and Washington's position was stronger than ever. Gates and Wilkinson had also had a massive falling out over the event. While serving on the Board of War, Wilkinson had turned on Gates, and the two became bitter enemies. Wilkinson had thrown his lot in with Washington, and even ended up challenging Conway to a duel on behalf of his future president. The duel was called off a few times, but eventually happened. Neither man was injured. However, Conway himself was eventually killed in another duel in 1778. Before his death, though, Washington had revealed to Conway that Wilkinson was the source that had betrayed the plan early on. With his involvement on both sides, many in both the Continental Army and Congress distrusted Wilkinson. What little military engagements he had been involved in had ended in failure as well. Eventually, Wilkinson was appointed Clothier General of the Army, basically responsible for providing uniforms and supplies. In this role, he failed so badly that he was forced to resign a few years later. When the war ended, Wilkinson ended up as an assemblyman representing Kentucky. Kentucky was not a state at the time, instead existing as a territory of Virginia. Wilkinson was a proponent of Kentucky becoming a state, and his frustration with the new US government delaying this process led him down a traitorous path. This was a betrayal that wouldn't be discovered until decades after his death. But before we get to that revelation, there is another dark chapter in Wilkinson's life, one that involves the alleged murder of another man. When the Continental Army was reorganized into the official military of the United States, Washington was tasked with deciding its commander. He had a choice between Wilkinson and another man named Anthony Wayne. Eventually, Wilkinson lost out to Wayne, mostly due to questions about Wilkinson being too friendly with Spain. Wilkinson didn't take this slight lightly. He began a campaign of slander and libel against Wayne. He consistently criticized Wayne's decisions openly to Washington and the Congress. Eventually, Wayne fought back and began an investigation into Wilkinson's ties to the Spanish government. He claimed to have discovered some damning evidence against Wilkinson, but just as he was set to present this to a court-martial, Wayne became very ill. He passed away due to what doctors described as a sudden and acute stomach ulcer. However, decades later, further investigation revealed that Wilkinson may have had Wayne poisoned to avoid a startling revelation that could have led to his own execution. Wilkinson would continue to serve both the new US government as well as his own interests. Eventually, he would try his hand at another act of potential treason, this time with Aaron Burr. He became involved in the infamous Burr conspiracy. Meeting with Vice President Burr, Wilkinson had exchanged letters about a plan to create a second independent country in the unincorporated territories of Mississippi. However, when the plot was revealed, Wilkinson would do what he did best and betray his co-conspirators. He sent a letter to then-President Jefferson about the plan, leading to Burr's arrest. Wilkinson ended up testifying against Burr himself. He had altered the letters to hide and downplay his own involvement and presented them at Burr's trial. His testimony backfired, however, as the court found Wilkinson so untrustworthy that Burr was acquitted of the charges. During this time, Wilkinson had also illegally placed New Orleans under martial law, just so he could round up and detain anyone who could point the finger back at him. These events led to Wilkinson being ousted from his government roles and ostracized by those in power. Finding himself on the outside again, Wilkinson would return to the military for the War of 1812, eventually ending up court-martialed for incompetence. In his last years, he attempted to become an official envoy to Mexico, where he died in 1825. In some ways, his death was only the beginning of the story. Years after he passed away, the scope of Wilkinson's betrayal of America was fully revealed. 4 decades later, the historian Charles Gaillard made a bombshell discovery. While researching Wilkinson and other figures at the Spanish Royal Archives in Madrid, he discovered conclusive evidence that Wilkinson had been a spy for the Spanish government. During Wilkinson's life, Spain had control over several North American territories. While Wilkinson had been in charge of the Kentucky Territory, he made a trip to Spanish-controlled New Orleans. There he met with Governor Esteban Rodriguez Miro, and the two formed a secret pact against America. Miro would allow Kentucky to have a monopoly on trade up the Mississippi River if Wilkinson would serve Spanish interests. Wilkinson even went as far as signing a secret document swearing both his and Kentucky's allegiance to the Spanish king. With America having just fought a war against one king, he had attempted to deliver it into the hands of another. His actions as a spy for a foreign government was mostly done to enrich himself. The Spanish made several payments to Wilkinson in secret, in exchange for him delivering information and attempting to deliver Kentucky to Spanish control. He was even given a code name at the time, being dubbed Agent 13. It was one of these secret payments that was intercepted by Anthony Wayne's men. It was Wilkinson's status as Agent 13 that Wayne had planned on revealing to the world at Wilkinson's court-martial. Only Wayne's sudden death saved Wilkinson from this fate. It was the timing that led many to suspect that Wilkinson, along with help from the Spanish government, had secretly poisoned Wayne. The symptoms Wayne had before his death were described as an acute, violent malady affecting his stomach and intestines. While Wayne had issues with gout previously, he was in full health before his sudden death. With the extent of Wilkinson's self-serving betrayals laid bare before the American people decades after his death, his legacy was cemented. 65 years after his death, then Governor of New York Teddy Roosevelt condemned Wilkinson, writing, "In all our history, there is no more despicable character." And that's who James Wilkinson was, an incompetent commander, a self-serving liar, and a secret enemy to a fledgling America. He constantly betrayed those who trusted him and used these betrayals to advance his own personal wealth and status. Now, centuries after his death, he is remembered as America's worst traitor. What do you think of Wilkinson's many betrayals, and what else do you know about this infamous historical figure? Leave a comment, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more videos from History Snob. Thanks for watching.